Welcome to the Open Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host.
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we've been in the field of grief and loss for a long time, and trying to
Yeah.
find meaning in it is, what people are kind of all about. And we're going to talk about meaning making after a traumatic loss today with
hmm
an unusual person because she is very, very highly educated as a surgeon and has gone on to think about these kinds of issues, which in my background, I was in nursing, and I found a lot of doctors are just there, doing their job as they should, but they really haven't had a lot of thought about meaning making and what it means to have losses and to be in the healthcare field. All right, Heidi, do you want to introduce our guest?
I would love to. Like you said, Mom, we're going to be talking today about meaning making after traumatic loss. Our guest is Dr. Melissa Red Hoffman, also known as Red, which I love. Um, she is an acute care surgeon at Mission Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. I did say a surgeon, acute care surgeon, which is very, very incredible. Um, she is just one of 90 surgeons board certified in hospice and palliative medicine, which I find amazing. And Red hosts the podcast, The Surgical Soul. And she has recently been on a TED Talk, which I watched and was very powerful. Please Google her and you will see this TED Talk. It comes up right away and you can listen to it. And Red has had 2 traumatic deaths, and she will talk more about that on her TED Talk. One was the murder of her father, and the other one was the suicide of her boyfriend. Welcome to our podcast, Red.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, tell us about your losses. I know you lost your dad. Really, he was murdered, right?
Yeah, my dad, he was 47 years old and I was 19, and he was on a business trip in Cairo, Egypt, working on a pipeline between Egypt and Israel. And he was, unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was out to dinner at a restaurant in a very well-known hotel. And he, at the end of the dinner, as they got up to leave, the man behind him got up and shot him, and then shot his friend, Bob, who also died, and then also shot his colleague, Merrill, who actually survived to tell me the entire story. And
Wow.
yeah, it was.
Why were they killed for a reason, or was it just a random act of violence?
So what this man was, he wasn't part of any group, but he was certainly very, I think, radicalized by his religion, and
Wow.
what made that very clear in what he said, and his action
Wow.
years later made it even more clear. So.
Yeah, and I love in your TED Talk. Your TED Talk is awesome, and I would suggest everybody go listen to it. It's meaning making after traumatic loss. But in your talk, you talk about you decided then to make meaning out of it and make your dad proud, right?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, and I say this to, especially for listeners who are like new in their traumatic grief, that was a journey that took many, many, many years. But what I did know right away was that my dad loved me and believed in me. And of course, I lived to make him proud. I think it took me
Mhm.
almost 2 decades to realize the thread that got me into wanting to be a trauma surgeon and a palliative care doctor. Um, but I'll say now that my life is infused with meaning, and it really did all start with my dad's murder.
Mhm.
I was thinking of you, Heidi, how your brother's death has impacted your life.
Well, I was thinking that when I heard this about, with Red, and I just was at the tragedy assistance program over the weekend working with military families that have had a loss. And I said, when we look at what we're doing and so many choices in our lives, like you said, Red, we follow that string back and go, wait a minute, a trauma surgeon and my father died traumatically. There's a connection here that I might not have even realized as I was pursuing that, right? It
Yeah.
is interesting, and I certainly would not have been a clinical psychologist with a specialty in trauma if my brother had not died traumatically. So it is interesting.
I will say though, for a long time, especially like earlier in my grief, I did a lot of that not magical thinking, that thinking of, well, would I trade my life to make to have my dad alive again? And really like spent a lot of energy on this real false question. That's not how the world works. And it's okay
Right.
that my life ended up good and my dad died. Like, but I gave a lot of I wasted a lot of energy with these kind of false beliefs that, well, would I pick my dad or would I pick this? And that, that's not life. My dad's dead. And I really thankfully was able to make a lot of meaning out of his death and utilize everything I learned after his death to help other people, which, I mean, what a blessing is that?
And that,
I heard someone say something once, which I thought was interesting. They said, make your mess your mission.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
well, that's not the end of the story with you because,
Yeah.
we could end it right now. Okay, end of podcast. But then what happens to you years later and how many years after your dad's death?
Yeah, that was 27 years later. My partner at the time, who I'd been with for almost 5 years, fell off a ladder at work and had a traumatic brain injury. And I always say that in and of itself was ironic because I'd say at least half the patients on my census every day as a trauma surgeon are patients with mild traumatic brain injuries. And he suffered terribly, terribly, terribly. I mean, it was the worst 7 months of my life, I'd say. And he ended up dying by suicide in our backyard. And I witnessed that event. And now I will say that my father's death certainly set me up for that, because I always say it sounds so cheesy, but I swear after I found him, I ran away and called 911. But as I was walking back to where he died, I said like two things. I said, Red, this is not your fault. Like I knew enough to tell myself that. And then I said, you are going to make meaning out of this, because I felt like I'd already done all this before. And it was wild to like be in that spot and say like, I am not going to let this kill me, because I knew that it could, because it was so awful. And I also knew, again, because of my father's death, like what I needed. So like I was in therapy within 6 days, and I did like intensive therapy for about 18 months, which was like amazing to be able to just like step into that and start doing the work right away. Like I just knew what I needed because I'd been there before.
It's interesting when you talk about this because my husband died 4 years ago. I was married for 60 years, and Scott died 41 years ago. And I knew two things. When Phil died, I knew I could be happy again, and I knew I wouldn't die.
Yeah.
And those two things, it's horrible to have that kind of thing happen, but there is post-traumatic growth.
Yes. I always say, I see it with my patients' families a lot. Like I always say, grief begets grief. Like I see as people are sitting at the bedside waiting for their loved ones to die, all the other stories of all their other dead loved ones are coming off. But the flip side of that is that grief creates growth. And like, then we really can walk through it a little more skillfully. Not that it's any less hard. It was utterly awful. And I actually felt like, because of where I was at in my life when my boyfriend killed himself, I went deep down into my grief quick. Like, I didn't know what I was doing when I was 19. I didn't know anything about grief, but this time I like went all the way to the bottom, and I used to say I was devoid of joy. I hurt in ways that I didn't even hurt when my father was killed, but I kept like swimming because like I knew that there was like a shore on the other side. And again, I had all these tools, and being older helps, right? You just have more tools in your tool bag, regardless of whether you've had another grief or not. As you get older, you gather more tools.
Yep, you got it. I like that safe shore idea. Well, talk to us about what you're doing now, because now you've moved into the hospice work. Now, is this a result of your boyfriend dying? I was thinking hospice work is different than trauma, because in trauma you're trying to save people. In hospice, you are helping them have a safe journey out of their life.
Yeah. Well, I was already board certified in hospice and palliative medicine, but because of a lot of things that happened in my life, including kind of a chronic illness that happened right around the time my boyfriend got sick, my life really looked very different when I went back to work. And one of the things was I kind of had to make some changes, but I also wanted to make some changes because I looked at how my life was before my boyfriend's accident and I was like, I don't want it to look like that. It was all about work, you know? And I'm like, I want a life that has more joy, because I really had another reminder of how nothing is guaranteed. And so in trying to find that joy, you have to make room for it, right? And so part of that was moving to do surgery part-time and then filling that time, some of that time with doing more hospice work and more hospice administration work. And you know, to me, hospice and trauma surgery are not opposite. They're on the continuum of care. And that's why I love doing both, because if I can't save that life, then I always say, then at least I can try to give you a good death. And not, you know, in trauma, not every death is good. Some of them are, they're awful. And I can't pretend that they're not. Some of them are utterly awful. But there is an opportunity to try to walk with people.
You're not only impacting them, you're impacting their families.
Yes, yes.
My father-in-law had an amazing hospice team at the end of his life. And it really helped not just him, it helped his two sons and his wife, everybody. And they were devastated when the hospice team left because they had become part of the family.
Yeah, I always say that, like, what got me into all of this end of life work was as a surgery resident in your second year of training, you spend a lot of time in the ICU, and I really felt a kinship with the families, all of whom had, like, it was the trauma ICU. So all of these families, loved ones, were in the ICU because of a traumatic event. And some of the, you know, as we all know, some of the events are so crazy you can't even wrap your mind around it. And having had such a crazy experience with my dad, I just felt real kinship with these families and felt like, oh, I can sit with them and their stories don't scare me or freak me out. And that's really what got me into end of life care, because many times at the very end, the patient isn't conscious anymore, but the families need that love. And what happens at the bedside or in the home before the patient dies really sets the stage for how these families are going to grieve. And so I feel like I get to be a part of their grieving process even before the patient has left the earth.
I love that. So I have a question about your own situation. You talked about your dad a little bit. So you have experienced two very stigmatized and traumatic deaths. You had the murder of your father and the suicide of your boyfriend. What is unique and different about each one?
Sure. Well, I think in both of them, there is really a sense of isolation, because I think that while 50% of Americans will survive some sort of traumatic deaths in their life, overall, natural deaths, the deaths that occur, you know, because of disease usually, are more common. So I think I have always felt I think it can make people feel isolated. And then the other thing is these traumatic deaths often involve either law enforcement, the court system, or the media. And certainly in my dad's death, it involved all three. And in my boyfriend's, it involved 2 out of 3. And those things are really hard to navigate. I mean, most people don't know how to navigate the legal system. I've shared that, like, I'm a trauma surgeon. I thought the police were going to arrest me when they came, because and that's as a trauma surgeon, and I work with law enforcement all the time at work. And so you start getting a lot of irrational fears, and there's no one really to talk to it about. I think there's all these layers that people outside your circle or people even inside your circle really can't understand unless they've been there. So it makes it feel even more lonely.
Well, I will tell you, when Scott was killed, this woman from the local radio station wanted to come to my house, and I let her come. And you just don't, you're not being rational.
Right.
You know, you
Yes,
almost
right.
need a keeper when there's a sudden death. You
Right.
know, it's irrational. I agree.
What was fascinating was
Yeah.
my mom, who'd kind of gone through all this with my dad, she ended up just being, I mean, she's my best friend, but she ended up being such an amazing like source of support. Cause I think of all the people she got it. One, we were the same age when we lost our partners. And then two, like, I think she understood what it was to lose someone so traumatically and all those other moving pieces. Like I was so grateful that she was able to understand me on all those different levels,
That's lovely. What advice would you have to somebody who's had a traumatic loss?
Oh God, so much. Okay. Like, I think number one is you are not going to die yourself. I think the world feels really, really scary after you lose someone who has died traumatically. It feels really unsafe. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to sit with that. And that might feel like that for a long time, but you are not going to die from this. And then, number two, like, yeah, I've made a lot of meaning, but that could take years or decades, and there's no rush. Like, you just need to dive deep into that grief, and no one else has walked in your shoes. They have no idea. So like, you can dive as deep as you want. It's okay. You know what I mean? Eventually you'll come up for air, because in the end, we're programmed to live, right? We are programmed to live and to thrive. But if it takes you years, wow, for my mom, it took so many years. It's okay. This is your journey, no one else's,
Yeah,
And then three, get into therapy. And not only get into therapy with a trauma-informed therapist early, and have someone who can walk through and who understands all of these different layers and who can help you articulate what you're feeling. Because for me, especially the first time around, and part of it was my age, I was feeling all this stuff and I couldn't put words to it. And that just led to deeper and deeper sense of isolation. So if you can have someone to translate all of your stuff that you spit out to them into some language, I think it really helps connect with other people.
I love it. Well, thank you. And I think in this day and age, there's more opportunity to find that special therapist too, particularly internet and everything. You can try, you can find a specialist that can help you with this.
Yes, 100%.
Well, Red, thank you so much for being on the show, and tell us where people about your podcast again and your TED Talk and where people can find you.
Sure. So I would love for you all to listen to my TEDx talk, which is Making Meaning After Violent Death. I think anyone who has survived a violent death, or anyone who loves someone who has survived a violent death, will find some little tidbits of hope there. You can just Google that, as Dr. Heidi said. And then my podcast right now is The Surgical Soul with Red MD. And my goal there is to kind of pull those sterile towels back and kind of show what is going on in the brains and hearts of surgeons inside and outside the operating room. And then I'm on social media. You can just find me at Red MD and then ND for naturopathic doctor.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for being on our show today. It's been wonderful, and you have a great insight, and we appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you guys.
I agree with my mom, Red. You are a real inspiration about how we go on, how we make meaning after loss. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
We want to thank everybody for joining us on the show. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.